All right, let's go ahead. Let's go ahead and get started. So, unit 1 and 2, we did that already. Now let's do units 3 and 4. Units 3 and 4, that covers, of course, things like the Columbian Exchange, things like land-based empires, the most important being the gunpowder empires. Let's go ahead and get started. In terms of periods, where are we at? Period 1, that's what we did last content review. Period 2 is what we're doing. And on the AP, it's more likely for you to get an LEQ or likely for you to get a DBQ from starting at this time period. Last year, the DBQ was period 3, and I don't want to promise it'll be in period 2, but it's more likely to be in period 2. And actually, we're going to practice with a DBQ starting on Thursday. So let's go ahead and get started. Of course, last time I went through different course themes, and I'm going to highlight the biggest, most important things from each of these units. So let's start with the first one, humans and the environment. Probably the only thing related to the environment in terms of units 3 and 4, the biggest, most important thing is the Columbian Exchange. When I was kind of teaching about the Columbian Exchange in unit 4, there was a little bit of confusion between the Columbian Exchange and the triangle trade. The Columbian Exchange describes generally this idea of unintentional and intentional diffusion of disease, of plants and animals. Because prior to European exploration, the Americas was isolated, biologically speaking. Not a lot of animals and plants from the Americas were, or I should say from Europe and Asia, were present in the Americas. So we do kind of see that after European exploration, there will start to be this diffusion of unheard of technologies and plants, animals, and diseases into the New World. So kind of the thing to generally understand is the New World was biologically isolated prior to European context. And you should kind of memorize some of the big things being exchanged. You're probably likely to get an SAQ about the Columbian Exchange, and it's good to kind of have some information about what examples you could say for things being diffused. What's your question?
Is the history thing happening today?
For A push?
Yeah.
That's in Thursday, so tomorrow.
Okay.
Or you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Juniors. All right. So in terms of what is being diffused, kind of some of the things from the old, meaning Africa, Europe, and Asia, includes sugar and coffee. These are probably the two most important things because these will be the basis for a cash crop economy in the New World. So sugar especially is going to be a majorly produced commodity in the Caribbean, in Brazil. It's going to fundamentally change the landscape of North America because we are going to see that native plants are going to be choked out basically from these invasive species. So sugar is the most dominant cash crop in these American colonial societies. But things like citrus, apples, and oranges, all of these things come from Asia and Africa and Europe. Probably the most important animal being exchanged is horses. Horses did not really exist on North or South American continents until European contact. And that's going to have actually kind of a positive effect on many Native American societies. The Lakota Sioux, I'll write their name down. The Sioux, they're a nomadic society, and they are going to start using horses in their buffalo hunts, especially. So the Lakota Sioux are going to kind of benefit from the introduction. Oh gosh, darn it. Are going to benefit from the introduction of horses. Smallpox disease is the biggest killer during this time because, again, biologically isolated, not a lot of contact with European and African diseases. So actually kind of smallpox, that tends to be the answer. If you ever get something like, what is the largest reason why there's a population decrease in the Americas? It's because of disease, not because of imperial conquest. In terms of things going to Africa, Europe, and Asia, mostly it's going to kind of benefit Africa, Europe, and Asia. Hardy crops, crops that grow really well, crops that are kind of similar to champa rice in a way, the effect that champa rice had on China, we are going to see crops like potatoes and corn. Those are probably the two biggest things. And these are great vegetables because they're going to be easily produced, easily grown, but also are high in calories as well. The introduction of these new world crops into the old world is going to lead to a population increase. And that's not just going to happen in Europe, but also in China as well. Llamas and syphilis. Kind of syphilis is a disease that will come to the old world. I probably shouldn't tell that story about syphilis. All right. So kind of a big result of the Columbian Exchange is going to be the change to the American economy and to the environment as well. Cash crops grow really well in the New World. Sugar grows really well. There's a high demand for sugar, especially. So as Europeans build colonies in North and South America, they're going to build up sugar plantations. So sugar and cash crops being introduced into the Americas has an economic effect as well, the creation of a plantation economy. And yet with the creation of a plantation economy, the environment kind of takes a hit. We have monocropping, the draining of nutrients from fields, but also more deforestation. Honestly, if you get any question about the environment, no matter what unit, no matter what time period, deforestation is something that is going on at that time. But we also do see the environment impacts is going to be impacted by governments as well. Kind of something we are seeing is that governments are becoming more centralized. And a way a government becomes more centralized is building up infrastructure, building up roads. The Inca are a good example of that in the Americas. But also we have different infrastructure projects in Europe as well, the building of more complex harbors and ports to support trade. But of course, kind of something that will generally be true, something that will be more important for your DBQ, is that kind of something that is also motivating expansion is the desire for raw materials. Why are European countries building colonies in the New World? They want to have plantations, sugar plantations. So the desire for raw materials is motivating overseas expansion. It's motivating increased European presence in the Indian Ocean. But it's also kind of motivating Russian expansion as well. The Russian Empire is building at this time. It's a land-based empire, and they want fur. They want to kill cute little beavers and foals and use their skin for, fur. Yeah, I know. That's history. All right. Any questions about kind of the environment? Probably the biggest thing, though, is the Columbian Exchange. I would probably say an SAQ you might get about this. Yeah. No, you can't. All right. Any other questions that are more content related? All right, let's talk about culture. So culture also contains ideas of religion. So religion is going to be kind of a big theme of Unit 3 and 4 as well. We're going to see that there are new religions starting to develop. The Protestant Reformation is happening at this time. And you won't need to know the kind of exact minute details of the Protestant Reformation. It's caused because of indulgences, but you're probably not going to get a question about that on the AP. What's more important is that these new religions are oftentimes going to result in increased interstate rivalries. So with the rise of new religions, we are going to see kind of continued wars based largely on religion. In the Muslim world, the biggest kind of divide is between Shia and Sunni Muslims. So that's a major continuity throughout this class is going to be these religious divides between Sunni and Shia Muslims. And a good example of that is the Ottoman-Safavid Wars. The Ottoman Empire is Sunni, the Safavids are Shia. You don't need to know much about the Safavids, quite frankly, but the thing you would need to know is they're Shia, and they don't like the Ottomans. But we also do see religious conflict between Hindus and Sunnis as well on the Indian subcontinent, between the Mughal Empire, Sunni, and the Maratha Confederacy, which is Hindu. In Europe, we also see religious violence as well. Catholic countries like France, for example, they're going to go to war with Protestants. So Protestants versus Catholics, a good example of that is the 30 Years' War, that largely contains much of the European states. So we do see that unit 3 and 4, this is a time of new religions. Protestantism is one example, a third branch of Christianity. But we also do see that in this atmosphere of cross-cultural interactions, there will be examples of syncretism. And one example of that is Sikhism. Sikhism is a religion on the Indian subcontinent that will blend together Hindu ideas, especially things like reincarnation, and Islam. Islam is a monotheistic religion. Sikhism, also a monotheistic religion. All right. In terms of the spread of religion, yes, diffusion keeps happening. Trade leads to diffusion more often than not. But as colonies start to form in the Americas, we do see the spread of religion through groups like the Jesuits. The Jesuits, you could best compare them to the Sufis. The Sufis spread Islam around the world. The Jesuits do the same thing. Kind of one thing about the Protestant Reformation that's important is the Catholic reaction to it, the Counter-Reformation. So the Catholic Church, in order to make sure there are more Catholics around the world, they're going to be much more involved in universalizing, spreading Catholicism, especially into places like the Americas, Latin America, but also into Asia as well. Basically, they're trying to convert as many people as possible to make sure there are more Catholics than Protestants. Sufis continue to spread Islam, but we also do see the diffusion of Islam because of the transatlantic slave trade. Most of these slaves being taken from West Africa, some of them are Muslims. Some of them practice indigenous religions, but we do see that as Muslims, as Black slaves, I should say, are being transported to the New World, they're diffusing, they're taking with them their faith as well. We also do see especially the Spanish. They're the biggest kind of Catholic missionizers during this time. They're going to build a bunch of missions. Missions are basically churches that have the design purpose of converting nearby Native Americans. And that's going to be kind of leading to a long-term continuity in Latin American history, the dominance of the Catholic Church. It starts because of Spanish colonization. But obviously, as religion spreads, we see syncretism. We see Sikhism in India, a mix of Hindu and Muslim, but we also do see syncretism of Christianity, Islam, and indigenous African religions. And the best example of this is Voodoo, or Voodoo, as it's sometimes called. Voodoo is a mixture of West African native traditions, Islam, and Catholicism. So kind of as people are moving around the world, whether intentionally or not, we do see this diffusion and creation of new religions. In terms of some other continuities, we have this idea of ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is kind of this belief of focusing purely on your ethnicity. It's this idea of ethnic superiority in a way. And we do see that many societies in East Asia are becoming more isolationist during this time. I'll talk about that more later. But we do kind of see this idea of the Middle Kingdom continue in China. But we also do see this isolationist idea in Japan as well. Japanese culture needs to be protected from outside influences, especially the Jesuits. The Jesuits, they wanted to convert a lot of people in Japan, and Japan's response to that was cutting off foreigners. Another kind of related theme to religion is this idea of tolerance versus intolerance. Some places will have religious tolerance. Land-based empires want to keep the peace in their society, so there is this idea of tolerance. Akbar is a really good example of that in India, the Mughal Empire. Akbar the Great is a religiously tolerant guy. He's a Muslim, but he allows for Hindus to worship as they see fit. And yet, even though the Mughal Empire does practice tolerance, we do see intolerance as well in the figure of Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb is religiously intolerant. He wants a centralized state by having a uniform religion, Islam in his case. So kind of during this time, we see that there is this continuity in the spread of religion, but we do see that as states centralize power, they're going to use religious differences as an excuse to go to war with other political rivals. The Ottoman Empire against the Safavids, the Mughals against the Marathas, and various Protestant Europeans versus Catholics. All right. So any questions about kind of culture during this time? Religion is a big continuity in this time period. Awesome. So now we go on to government. Unit 3 is literally called land-based empires. And of course, that's the focus of Unit 3. So what are some of the big land-based empires the AP wants you to know about? Well, the gunpowder empires, that describes generally Muslim land-based empires that use gunpowder. But the most important ones, I talked about the Safavids in class, but you really don't need to know that much. They're Shia and they hate the Ottomans. That's basically what you would need to know. But the two most important ones are the Ottomans and the Mughals. The Ottomans are going to be a good example of a gunpowder empire, and they're going to have all of these trends that I'm going to talk about in a second. But other land-based empires include the Russians and the Qing dynasty, specifically in China. The Qing dynasty is going to emerge as a formerly Central Asian nomadic society, and they're going to invade China and make their own dynasty and engage in land-based expansion. So kind of something that sometimes pops up is that these land-based empires tend to have roots as nomadic societies. The Ottomans, for example, they can trace their origins back to the Ilkhanate, the Muslim Mongol Empire in the Middle East. So gunpowder empires, a big thing to kind of remember, one of the things to remember, is that they tend to have Central Asian nomadic heritage. All right. But how do gunpowder empires, how do these land-based empires expand? Well, it's in the name, gunpowder. Military technology includes cannons and muskets. But also, we do see the creation of professionalized militaries. These are militaries that have a set standard of pay, and they are loyal directly to the monarch, to the leader of that society. And the two examples for this are the Janissaries in the Ottoman Empire and the Cossacks in the Russian Empire. So these are militaries that use gunpowder, and they are loyal to the centralized state, the center state. But generally around the world, the trend is going to be more centralization. Centralization is generally happening everywhere in the world, not just in land-based empires. But kind of the reason why we see centralization is the development of new political ideas. Period 1, what we talked about last time, was mostly focused on decentralization. But the slow trend was towards more centralized monarchs, governments that had stronger power over the economy, over government, and society. And that all relates to this idea of absolutism. Absolutism believes in the absolute power of a central figure, of a king, of an emperor, for example. And these are kind of big ideas associated with centralization. Basically, governments are becoming more organized and more powerful over the economies and lives of different people. So in one way, we see these bureaucracies start to form. A bureaucracy is basically all the institutions that support a government. So things like census taking, things like taxation, all of these will expand under different land-based empires. And one example of this is the Ottoman Empire with the Devshirme. The Devshirme is basically the bureaucracy of the Ottoman Empire. It is the government system that is in charge of things like taxes, census taking, and communication as well. So these large government institutions able to support tax collection, able to support infrastructure building, able to support communication. Another kind of trend, how do you centralize power, is that you legitimize your rule through culture. There's a continuity with a theater state from the previous time period. So in terms of art and culture being used, well, the biggest and best example is Louis Sexy Legs the 14th. Louis the 14th, he builds the really big Palace of Versailles, and he kind of makes it a place that shows his wealth, his personal power over France as a whole. Remember, kind of in Versailles, Louis had that system where nobles competed to make sure they were there when he woke up in the morning. Basically, we see that through the creation of these huge palaces, it's reducing the cultural power of the nobility. Also, improved taxation systems are going on at this time. Some different examples of taxation, the Zamindars in the Mughal Empire. These were nobles that were picked out by the Mughal emperors to be in charge of tax collecting. So nobles that directly answer to the Mughal emperors, and they pay the Mughal emperors their taxes. But also, you could say that the Aztecs had a centralized taxation system as well. They had the tribute system. In terms of religion, kind of some states will have religious tolerance. Some states are going to say there are too many religions in our society. We might as well grant religious freedom to all of them. And that's going to be true for a lot of these empires, for the Ottomans, especially the Mughals for some of their time period. But we do see examples of intolerance as well. How do we maintain absolute power? We have a uniform religion. Everyone practices the same set of beliefs. And probably the best example of that is Spain, actually. Spain is going to have institutions like, anybody remember? The Spanish Inquisition, yes. So institutions to enforce religious conformity, Spain being a good example. But also religion is continually, there's another thing, used to justify political authority. And that's the concept of divine right. I should be ruler because God said so. So basically we see a continuity in using religion to justify political rule. You could almost say that's similar to the mandate of heaven in China. Yeah. All right. However, we also see at the same time two examples of governments that don't have absolute power given to kings and queens. And those two examples are England and the Netherlands. These could be good examples of a counter argument on an AP. That's why I bring them up. Because we do see in England and the Netherlands, we see the creation of constitutional monarchies, kings and queens that have their power restricted by a constitution. England has a constitution. Well, it has a lot of different documents it can call the constitution. Anybody know one of those things that was created in 1215? Yeah. Yeah, the Magna Carta, exactly. And also the Netherlands was a republic during this time, so they had a constitution. All right. So these are some general trends. This is basically Unit 3 in a nutshell. There are various land-based empires that expand because of military technology, gunpowder being the most important, and they secure power through all of these things. Two examples of societies without kings or queens with absolute power is England and the Netherlands. All right. Any questions before we look at colonies real quick? Yes. Really by the 1400s, so really by the end of period 1, because of the silver, just to connect it again. All right, any other questions? All right, so Unit 4 talks about ocean-based empires. So this includes kind of these big European powers, the French, the British, the Netherlands, the Spanish, and the Portuguese. The Spanish and the Portuguese kind of fall off, if you will, after this period is over. So they don't really become relevant after Unit 4, but we do start to see other European empires starting to build overseas colonies. France, Britain, the Dutch, and the Spanish and Portuguese. And we kind of see that these societies are going to be other examples of state centralization. They are using government resources to promote overseas exploration. Kind of the main reason why Europe begins to explore overseas is that governments give money and financial assistance to European explorers. And probably the best, most well-known example of that is Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus was bankrolled by the Spanish monarchy, Ferdinand and Isabella. Another example of that is Portugal. Portugal is going to fund a institution called the School of Navigation. Basically, it's a fancy school. It might not have existed, funnily enough, but nevertheless, we do see government support for Portuguese explorers, Vasco da Gama and Ferdinand Magellan. Those are two examples right there. All right. But in terms of kind of governing over these colonies, we do see a difference in the direct involvement of these places. In French, Spanish, and Portuguese colonies, we tend to see more government presence, European government presence, I should say, in the everyday affairs of these colonies. These colonies tend to be ruled over by what we call viceroys. These are essentially governors that represent the direct interests of the Spanish king, of the French king, of the Portuguese king in the New World. So there's a lot more European control over these societies. Spain, France, and Portugal are created. However, in the English and the Dutch colonies, these colonies tend to be governed by representative colonial governments, meaning that there is going to be more elections in a way. In the places that will become the US, for example, we do see kind of these colonial governments are basically republics. They have their own constitutions. So that will kind of help explain the feeling of nationalism that will help lead to the American Independence War. All right, and kind of this relates to another big theme right here, is this idea of direct sponsorship, of direct European monarch control over these colonies versus this concept of a joint stock company. A joint stock company is a company that basically has stock or shares of that company that can be purchased by private individuals. So kind of England and the Netherlands, their colonies are mostly going to be created through joint stock companies. These are created as business ventures by private individuals. Whereas Spanish and Portuguese colonies, those tend to be directly supported and governed directly by the Spanish and Portuguese kings. All right. In terms of where colonies are being built, well, in the New World, they are inland colonies. There's huge expansion taking over Aztec and Inca empires, to use the Spanish examples. So we do kind of see that in the New World, it's more inland colonial development. Whereas in Africa and Asia, Europe is not the dominant superpower that it will be in the next time period. Europe is going to mostly stick to trade posts. Trade post empires characterize European presence in Africa and Asia prior to 1750. I'm going to talk about mercantilism more later on the economic side of things, but it's another way governments are centralizing power by regulating trade between the colonies and the European countries. And yet, as these countries build colonies, they're going to compete with each other. There will be warfare for more colonial spaces. So, European powers are going to compete with each other for colonies. There's a continuity, if you will, with the next time period. And that does result in conflict. The 7 Years' War is a conflict between the French and the British over influence around the world. The French and the British fight for control over Canada and India and the Ohio River Valley as well. Same thing with the War of Spanish Succession. Basically, Britain is going to compete with Spain for influence in the Caribbean. And guess what? Britain is going to win. But we also do see that there is going to be conflict between Muslim land-based empires and European maritime empires. Both of these places are competing for influence in the Indian Ocean. But at this time, both Muslim powers and European powers are basically equal when it comes to military superiority. Europeans do not have the economic or financial or technological edge until, anybody remember a certain revolution industrially? The Industrial Revolution, yes. How dare you? All right, and I'm going to talk about mercantilism more later, but any questions about these maritime empires? Anything you would want me to explain just a little bit? All right, other trends in terms of government during this time. Well, in East Asia, there tends to be a trend of isolationism. Countries like China, countries like Japan tend to be more isolationist during this time. Kind of Japan is very worried, for example, of European influence overtaking Japanese culture, to use one example. So there is this fear that Jesuits are coming in and they're taking over Japan. So that kind of is going to motivate this trend towards isolationism. In Japan, we see the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate, which is more centralized than earlier periods of Japanese history. But kind of it is still a very decentralized government structure. But the big thing that they do enforce is isolationism. They want to protect Japanese society from European influence. So that means they're going to cut off and restrict trade with Europeans to just the island of Tsushima, which is in Nagasaki Bay. But we also see that the Ming and the Qing dynasty in China are also engaged in isolationism. The Ming are going to be more isolationist because they're the dynasty that came after the Mongols in China. The Mongols were foreigners. They were people that came in and invaded China, and they brought in Islamic scholars, they brought in scholars from Europe. They basically kind of threatened this uniqueness of Chinese cultural identity. So the Ming are going to be very isolationist. They're going to cut off overseas trade. They're going to stop sponsoring Zheng He, for example. Zheng He, as you remember, he explored the Indian Ocean. However, after he dies, the Ming dynasty is going to revert to isolationism again. So we do see that the Ming dynasty is isolationist. Mostly this is a continuity with Neo-Confucianism, if you will. The Qing dynasty are going to be a little bit more open to trade, but they still are going to restrict European presence. And an example of that is the Canton system. Basically, the Qing dynasty is going to say, Europe, if you want to trade, you can only do it in the province of Canton. And we also see that the Chinese, regardless of the dynasty, they are going to heavily regulate what comes into China. They only want one thing, and that is silver. They're willing to trade, but they only want to buy silver from European empires. And guess what? European empires do have silver thanks to South America, thanks to American colonization. All right. Another continuity, if you will, during this time is that empires and kingdoms tend to form based on trade networks. In West Africa, we see Congo and Benin. These empires will form to capitalize on the transatlantic slave trade, actually. All right. And before I talk about these examples of resistance, any questions about isolationism in East Asia or about kind of this idea of empires form to control trade? That's just a continuity during this time. All right. Here are some examples of different resistance to authority. Because as states centralize, people will resist taking away power, especially from the nobility. So we are going to see kind of various examples of people resisting a colonial expansion. In the Americas, for example, we're going to see Native Americans resist the Spanish and the British, and the English, I should say. In New Mexico, in New Spain, I should say, in modern day New Mexico, there's a big indigenous revolt called the Pueblo Revolt. So a bunch of Native Americans, collectively called the Pueblo, they resist Spanish occupation. And it's a very similar thing in British North American colonies. In Massachusetts, there's something called King Philip's War, or Metacom's War, it's sometimes called. And it's basically Native Americans in North America, in British North America, resisting the British presence there. But we also see on the Indian subcontinent, Hindus resisting the Mughal Empire, the Muslim Mughal Empire. And one example of that is the Maratha Confederacy. This is basically a nation of Hindus that emerges to resist Mughal presence on the Indian subcontinent. Sometimes the nobility will resist centralization, One example of that is going to be something called Pugachev's Rebellion in Russia. This is really just basically a big rebellion by ethnic Cossacks, who were nobles that didn't want to take away their power to Catherine the Great in Russia. Slaves also resisted, of course, during this time. And some ways were through passive resistance, breaking tools, running away. But we also do see people running away and forming what we call maroon colonies. These are basically settlements outside of European colonies where escaped slaves would live and basically kind of live their free existence in the North American wilderness. But we also do see conflict between African nations and Europe as well. In West Africa, we see this war. We see a war being led by the Ngando people of West Africa, and specifically their queen was Queen Nzinga. She is going to lead resistance against the Portuguese and their encroachment or growing influence over Angola. But we also do see that European empires, they are not able to compete against Muslim land-based empires like the Mughals. So really, we don't see kind of a change in the balance of power until, again, the Industrial Revolution. In the Anglo-Mughal Wars, basically the English, they wanted to take more trading privileges from the Mughal Empire. How did the Mughal Empire respond? Well, they went to war, and guess what? They won. Good for them. All right. Any questions so far? If you're comfortable with at least one of these examples, then you're probably going to be fine. All right. So let's move on from government and talk about economic systems. What's the trend? Overseas trade starts to become more dominant in terms of global interconnected communities. Overland trade is starting to decline because of the discovery of the Americas, because of the transatlantic trading system. So we do tend to see a trend of the decline of overland trade, and that's actually going to very much hurt land-based empires. The Ottoman Empire was a land-based empire that depended on Silk Road trade. But as the Ottoman Empire expanded, they took over Constantinople, which was a European endpoint of the Silk Road. So when the Ottomans took over Constantinople, they effectively cut off Europe from trade with Asia. And as a result, Europe is going to start exploring overseas to get directly to India and China. So we are going to see that kind of some trends in overseas trade is that Europeans begin to have more direct contact with societies in Africa and Asia. Before then, Europeans kind of had to go through Middle Eastern empires. They had to go through the Byzantine Empire. They had to go through West African societies. But now we start to see, because of innovations in maritime exploration, more direct trade and contact between Europeans and societies in the Americas, Asia, and Africa. This relates to kind of the theme of exploration. Why did Europe explore? Well, they wanted to explore to find an easier trade route to India and China. That's kind of the biggest motivation of all. They wanted to have a more direct access to Indian and Chinese markets. But also kind of people wanted to explore because they wanted to stay economically competitive with political rivals. One other thing that I should mention is that states tried to look for something called the Northwest Passage. So the Northwest Passage, that mythical route to get to Asia by going west, basically. So the Northwest Passage is one of the motivations for trade. But in terms of kind of what is being traded at this time, even though Europe wants Chinese and Indian goods, China and India don't want European goods. Because China only really wants one thing, and that's silver. China is the manufacturing center of the world prior to 1750. They have all the stuff everybody wants, And because of ideas of ethnocentrism, they don't want European-made goods. The only thing they want is something they can't make themselves, and that, of course, is silver. So China is still kind of the leading manufacturer in the international community. In terms of the Indian Ocean, well, we do mostly see Europe is going to remain in trade post colonies. So we do mostly see European trade post empires in Africa and Asia. At this time, Muslim merchants are still the dominant economic force in the Indian Ocean. The only thing that's changing is that there are new ocean trade systems in the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean, I didn't really talk about in class all that much, but basically what's going on is Spain has the Philippines. They're trading silver to the Philippines to go to China. You wouldn't need to know about that. All right. So Indian Ocean trade is still continuing. The only difference, the only change is that Europeans are also there. They have the better boats. They have the compass. They have the astrolabe. They can get there themselves. So Europe is going to kind of be included in the Indian Ocean trade, but Muslims still are the dominant superpower there. In the Atlantic Ocean, that is where Europe is thriving because they aren't competing with anybody else besides other European powers. So we do see kind of that triangle trade. The triangle trade, of course, describing raw materials go to Europe. Europe makes manufactured products sold in Africa. Africa sells slaves to be used in the Americas. Kind of something that goes on internationally is that as Europe begins to mine silver in South America, that will cause kind of international inflation. Land-based empires want the silver that European colonies produce. And that leads to a massive inflation crisis around the world. It will devastate the Ming Dynasty and the Ottoman Empire. These kind of empires will become weakened because of increased silver production. All right. So kind of one thing that to put down if you don't have it in your notes is that land-based empires are starting to decline as overland trade is starting to decline. Overseas trade is the big fashionable thing in the period between 1450 and 1750. All right, what questions might you have? All right, let's go to mercantilism. Yeah, it's done. Okay, in terms of kind of work, well, let's see some changes. Well, in China and India, again, these are mostly manufacturing centers. So we do see a big part of these economies is artisan labor, meaning people who are skilled in manufacturing. In Europe, kind of some changes is that we start to see more merchant presence in Europe because of expanding overseas trade. So increasingly, there is more of a merchant class that is present in Western Europe. And it's largely because merchants are organizing trade, especially in raw materials like sugar. There's a consumer market emerging in Europe for high-priced luxury goods like sugar, I should say. And kind of a result of all of this increased trade is something called the commercial revolution. Basically, this describes Europe's economy transitioning from agriculture to trade. That's what the commercial revolution is. This transition from agriculture to trade. And a result of this transition to trade is a new economic system of capitalism. Capitalism is an economic system in which private individuals own their own companies, in which they own their own quote unquote means of production. So individuals own private companies. That's starting to emerge at this point. Privately owned corporations start to emerge at this time. So kind of when you're studying, kind of think about when things start and when things are over. Serfdom is over by this point in Western Europe. And capitalism, wage economies, are starting to emerge. So we really don't see capitalist or industrial development before this time period. In terms of other labor, well, there is, of course, coerced or unfree labor at this time. How do you make sure your colonies produce raw materials like sugar? Well, you import African slaves. The reason why slavery increases in the New World is sugar, is raw materials like cash crops, sugar and tobacco being the two biggest. So the use of African slaves is a big trend during this time. And the main reason for that is the development of plantation economies. Initially, Native Americans were used, but Native Americans died off thanks to disease from the Columbian Exchange. So instead, you already tap into existing slave trading markets in West Africa. Russia is going to still use serfdom during this time. It's kind of an example of how they are staying behind. They are not as centralized as Western Europe. In the New World, we see the development of the encomienda system. Basically, this is a labor system in which a Spanish noble owns land and all of the Native Americans living on it. So this right of nobles over the labor of Native Americans, that's kind of going to assist in economic development in the New World. Native Americans were given protection and Catholicism in exchange for not being paid for their work. In terms of continuity, well, in Peru, in kind of the South American Spanish colonies, we see a continuity of the mita system. The mita system is basically a draft in which people are conscripted to work in Spanish colonial economy, yeah.
Does the encomienda system and costas thing go hand in hand?
They do, very much so. The casta system, I'll talk about more later, that racial hierarchy is kind of going at the same time as the encomienda system. Both help support each other. All right. We'll also see the use of indentured servants as well. Indentured servants are going to be basically people who enter these contracts that in exchange for free passage, they're going to work for a certain amount of time. 7 years labor is sometimes the number thrown around. Sometimes there is a promise of land, sometimes there's not. But basically, it is going to be one way European societies try to have labor on their plantations. But indentured servitude largely goes away, actually, because of a few reasons. For one thing, indentured servants had a degree of legal rights, and they were white. They could blend in easily with other European colonists. So instead, you're going to pick people that have no legal rights and are very ethnically and racially distinct. That would kind of stand out in a crowd. And that, of course, being people with darker skin, African slaves. You can't use Native Americans, they're dying off. The church also at one point says slavery of Native Americans is wrong. So that's why we do see a more reliance on African slavery. But kind of the general thing to understand is plantations, this economy is going to be the main reason why slavery will increase. It's very hard to make sugar. It's very hard to grow cash crops. Not a lot of white people will willingly do that. And that finally brings us to the last thing, trade. And in this case, we do see kind of regulations on trade during this time. For one thing, in China and Japan, we see isolation, restricting foreign presence in their country. But in terms of European colonies, this is where I come to my graph over here of mercantilism. What the hell is mercantilism? Because it is an important thing that distinguishes from other time periods in colonization. Well, mercantilism, again, largely in this time period right here, 1450 to 1750. And basically, this is how it would work. So, colonies in the Americas, what do they produce? Raw materials. However, under mercantilism, these colonies can only trade these raw materials to the European mother country. So they're going to trade these raw materials to Europe through a state-sponsored company. And a good example of this is the British East India Company. Colonies are going to produce raw materials. And these plantations, to use sugar as an example, they're going to sell their sugar to this state-sponsored company, who then sells these raw materials back to Europe. And all of this is regulated by law. So colonies can't trade with other colonies, and they can't trade with other European powers, only the mother country. However, kind of going back to mercantilism a little bit, European countries, manufacturers especially, they're going to use these raw materials to make manufactured products. So to continue with the example of sugar, in Europe, they make rum. So we're going to see that these European manufacturers, they're going to sell their products to state-sponsored corporations. And these state-sponsored corporations will sell the manufactured products to Europeans in these colonies. And these European colonies, they can only buy manufactured products from this state-sponsored company. So kind of we do see that European countries tend to benefit more from mercantilism. These manufacturers, well, they can charge higher and higher prices for their manufactured products. And the people in the colonies have to buy them. So we do see that these decisions were often made without the consent of the colonists. And mercantilism is also going to be supported by increased taxation as well. So we do see in order to pay for and support this state-sponsored company, taxes go up for colonists. So kind of mercantilism is a major explanation for why independence movements will happen in the future after 1750. Why does Latin America resist? Mercantilism. Why does the United States resist? Mercantilism. And all of these decisions being made without the consent of the government. All right, really big topic. So I want to really quickly talk to whoever's right next to you. What do you understand about mercantilism? Before I kind of will answer any questions about other time periods. Talk to your neighbors.
So mercantilism is basically like economic restrictions. Only to company through so things of the country. And we can basically it's a yearly.
Okay, so basically.
So I can't.
Yeah.
Is the British tax an example of
I'm pretty sure this is why I'm not defended. You know, I'm not looking at it.
All right. All right, does anybody does anybody have any questions about mercantilism? Yeah.
Not about mercantilism, but about the economic classes.
Yeah.
The big commercial revolution, are merchants who are trusted now with more government.
They are, exactly, yes, kind of that is something that is happening in terms of social hierarchies. Merchants are becoming more trusted, you could say, more politically and economically important in European countries. All right, but going back to mercantilism, any questions, any lingering concerns you might have about this system? All right, just because we're here, in the period 1750 to 1900, mercantilism goes away. All of this goes away after 1750, and it's going to be replaced by this idea of free trade. And I'll talk about this more next time we meet. Yeah, laissez-faire, yes, exactly. But essentially, under this concept of free trade, a European country invades Africa and Asia and sets up a place, basically, to benefit British companies, for example. So the British government, they'll invade India, and this British government, they're going to kind of provide social order, but instead of having a state-sponsored company, it's private corporations. Private corporations have incentives to move to Asia and Africa and build and own all of the raw materials. So companies like that we'll talk about more later, like the De Beers Company, for example. All right. So kind of actually the Maya brought up the example of the British Raj. That would be more of an example of free trade right there. So the British government allowing for British companies to own and operate businesses across Asia, across India specifically. All right. So any questions about free trade? I'm going to talk about this more later, but it's just kind of different in between these two time periods. Alrighty then. We'll talk about the chem finally. All right. Social interactions. In terms of class systems, the nobility going down. Monarchs, their power is going up. So as we kind of see monarchs gain more centralized power, that means the nobility, they are reducing in their influence around the world. So really we do see that kind of European nobles, they lose their power. We're also going to see that the Russian nobility, the boyars, they also lose their power. All of these special terms, they just mean nobility in these countries. The Ottoman Timars, they are also the nobility of the Ottoman Empire. So all of these societies are going to start to see the decline of the nobility's power in favor of the monarch. These nobles oftentimes competed for roles in the government so that they could, but they would still be kind of under the control of the central monarch. And as kind of I mentioned earlier, answering the question in the back there, that's that we do start to see merchants becoming more politically and economically important, especially in Western Europe. In terms of other examples of social interaction, it goes back to what I said before about tolerance versus intolerance. Generally, a country will decide what to do about religion depending on their goal. Do they want to keep the peace in a multi-religious society, or do they want to centralize power by enforcing universal conformity? Some examples of tolerance, the Mughals, the Ottomans. Some examples of intolerance, the Spanish and the French. It's a really Spanish hatred unit, I guess. All right. We do start to see also that class systems are not just going to be based on nobles and the merchants, but also based on ethnic and racial hierarchies as well. Someone mentioned earlier, I think you did, the castas system. The castas system is this racial hierarchy in Spanish and Portuguese colonies. White European-borns, I meant European-born whites on top, American-born whites next to them, and then below them, mixed-race people, below them, Native Americans, and on bottom, people of African descent, slaves specifically. So the casta system is one example of a racial hierarchy starting to form as a result of the introduction of slavery, as a result of economic systems like the encomienda. Yeah.
Someone mentions like a thing during the Mongols, or is this after?
This is after. So kind of the Ming dynasty, excuse me, the Qing dynasty, they're also of Central Asian nomadic descent. They're going to make this kind of ethnic hierarchy, putting them on top and the native Han on bottom. All right. So these new economic and class systems start to form.
Did the Mughals also have the jizya tax?
Oh my God, you mentioned the jizya tax. Yes, they did have the jizya tax. So your good kind of counter argument, if you will, is that this wasn't real religious tolerance. They had to pay a special tax if you weren't a Muslim in the Ottoman and the Mughal Empire. So the jizya tax.
But didn't they enact?
That's true, actually. You did bring that up. Sorry.
But didn't they enact the jizya tax toward the end of the Mughal Empire?
Yes. So Aurangzeb kind of brought that jizya tax when he was being religiously intolerant, whereas Akbar, he got rid of it altogether. What? Oh. Okay. All right, and the jizya tax, that's a tax on non-Muslims, basically. All right, any questions about these social interactions? Basically, we start to see racial hierarchies starting to form, and we do see hierarchies based on religion as well. All righty then. I think we're almost done. Oh yeah, slavery. How could I forget slavery? I know, I'm problem. Okay. So in terms of slavery, some things that sometimes pop up on the AP is kind of understanding differences in the status of slaves. In Africa, slaves tended to have more rights and more opportunities for freedom. So slaves in Africa tended to be used as domestic servants. Sometimes they were used in the military, like the Janissaries, for example. And they did have a degree of legal and political rights. They did have some right to property. They could purchase their freedom as well. However, in the New World, we do kind of see that slavery is going to be more based on this idea of racial hierarchies. If you are born a slave, you're going to also be a slave. Kind of that status of slavery is passed down from mother to child. And there are very limited opportunities for freedom. Some people bought their freedom in the New World. However, there are going to be a lot of laws that regulate the existence and everyday life of free people of color. So we do kind of see that slavery in the New World is going to be much more rigid. There are racial hierarchies, whereas in Africa, there aren't these racial hierarchies. But also slaves in the New World, again, they're mostly used for plantations, for cash crop production. Transatlantic slave trade is a big topic, but you would need to know kind of impacts of it. That's kind of what's more important. The biggest impact is this concept known as the African diaspora. A diaspora is a movement of people. It can be forced, it can be free, it can be willing. But in this case, the African diaspora is going to describe slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. 12 million or so African Americans will be shipped to the New World throughout the course of the period between 1500 and the 1850s. And that's going to have a lot of impacts, of course, on the Americas. The introduction of a new class of people, a new group of people, but also on Africa as well. In Africa, we're going to actually see a bit of a gender gap starting to, emerge. Mostly Africans that are taken are men. So we do see that men are going to be largely taken away from Africa, and what remains mostly are women and children. And a result of this kind of increased level of women in West African societies is going to be that women will take on more traditionally male roles in West African societies. African women as merchants, for example. So we do see kind of the African diaspora leads to changes in gender roles in Africa. In terms of kind of other things that are happening at this time, African culture is coming to the New World, resulting in syncretism. But also we do see African farming ideas, especially rice production. That is going to actually come over from West Africa to the Americas. But obviously, I keep bringing it up, but the big impact of slavery is going to be the growth of cash crop production in the New World. Slavery is also going to kind of go hand in hand with racial hierarchies starting to form, the casta system being the best example of that. But we do see that there are opportunities for freedom. There are a class of people in French and Spanish colonies called the gens de couleur, or the people of color, basically, the men of color. These are free people who do have some rights. Economically, they own property, but they still are subject to that racial hierarchy. So kind of a big thing is that even if people get freed in the New World, they're subject to racial hierarchies. And of course, that's a major continuity next unit and the unit beyond, of course. But of course, a big result of culture spreading is syncretism. The best example is voodoo, which is a blend of indigenous West African traditions and Catholicism, mostly in the Caribbean. I say mostly in the Caribbean. But something that I kind of didn't mention earlier with syncretism is that in New Spain, between Native Americans and Catholics, we do start to see the diffusion, the syncretism of indigenous Native American culture and Catholicism. Kind of a really good example of that is the Lady of Guadalupe. She is, I misspelled Guadalupe. I don't know how to spell Guadalupe. Can somebody look up how to spell it?
I think that's
This one's right?
Yeah.
no way.
No way. You doubted my abilities. So, anyway, why did I mention Guadalupe? Well, the Lady of Guadalupe, she is a Catholic saint, but she has kind of her origins in Native American traditions. She is presented as an Aztec, a woman, actually, kind of combined with this Catholic purpose. She's the mother of Jesus, but she's kind of presented in Native American attire and Native American clothing. All right. So, slavery, a big topic of Unit 4 especially. All right, any questions about slavery and kind of its impact around the world? Pretty self-explanatory. All righty then. Technology. The biggest thing about technology in this unit is navigation and transportation. Kind of just memorize what technologies are used and what technologies come from where. From the Middle East, of course, we have the astrolabe, the Latin sail, astronomical charts, where are the stars basically, that will help with navigation. All of these things were developed in the Islamic Golden Age, but they spread to Europe because of the Silk Road. Europe uses all this technology to then explore the oceans. Wow. The compass is from China. The compass is more associated with ocean-based trade, not land-based trade. That's just something the AP wants you to know. But Europe does make their own innovations, you could say. We do kind of see that Europe is going to start developing new naval technologies, kind of incorporating all this Islamic influence and Chinese influence. The caravel, the carrack, and the flute, and the galleon, those are all types of ships. So any of those examples could be used as technology. The telescope is going to actually be more of a unique European invention. It's developed by Galileo Galilei, some nerd from Italy who did something with the planets. He's a nerd. Whoa. The telescope. No, Galileo. He should have been executed by the church. Anyway. So development of the telescope. But we also do see Europe is developing navigation schools, like the School of Navigation in Portugal. In terms of agriculture, some innovations, rice irrigation practices from Africa going to the Americas. But also we do see that sugar plantations are also going to be kind of high tech in a way. It costs a lot of labor, but there is kind of innovations there. In terms of the military, gunpowder. Boom. Gunpowder empires. All right. Spread by the Mongols, yes. Yes.
Would the rice irrigation also be an example of such interaction?
Yes, so kind of African slaves, they bring their traditions, not just culture, but also rice as well. So that innovation will lead to increased crop yields in the Americas. All right, any other questions? Alrighty then, let me know if, oh, yes. Voodoo is a mix of West African, Islam, and Catholicism. It's a good blend of all three. Oh, I didn't pause it all the way. Now I have to do this. Oh.